What would you do if saving a stranger's life cost you everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and family? When mechanic Ethan Cole pulled billionaire Isabella Marlowe from that burning wreck, he had no idea she would return 2 years later, wearing a lie so perfect it would shatter his world and then rebuild it in ways he never imagined. This is their story of deception, heartbreak, and a love that transcends every boundary. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The screech of metal against asphalt pierced the dawn silence like a blade through silk. Ethan Cole's weathered hands tightened around his coffee mug as he watched the black Bentley careen off Route 12, tumbling down the embankment in a symphony of destruction that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Steam rose from the wreckage like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven, and somewhere beneath the twisted metal, someone was dying. "Dad," 8-year-old Jacob's voice cracked with terror from the passenger seat of their pickup truck. His small fingers pressed against the window as orange flames began licking at the luxury car's undercarriage. "There's someone in there." Ethan was already moving his mechanic's instincts, overriding the voice in his head that screamed about Jacob, about responsibility, about all the reasons a single father shouldn't risk everything for a stranger. But as he sprinted down the rocky slope, his boots sliding on loose gravel, all he could think about was Sarah, his wife, his anchor, the woman who'd taught him that some things mattered more than safety. "Stay in the truck," he shouted over his shoulder, knowing Jacob would obey, because that's the kind of kid he was, responsible beyond his years, shaped by loss into something both fragile and fierce. The Bentley lay on its side like a wounded animal, its pristine black paint now scarred and smoking. Through the spider-webbed driver's side window, Ethan could see her, a woman in an elegant cream-colored dress, blood trickling from her temple. Her dark hair fanned across the deployed airbag like spilled ink on canvas. She was unconscious, maybe worse, and the acrid smell of gasoline made his stomach clench with urgency. "Ma'am." His voice echoed off the surrounding hills as he grabbed the door handle, muscles straining against the warped frame. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Nothing. The woman's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths that might stop at any moment, and Ethan could hear the dangerous hiss of leaking fuel growing louder. He had minutes, maybe less, before this became a cremation instead of a rescue. The driver's door wouldn't budge. Ethan circled the wreckage like a predator stalking prey, his experienced eyes cataloging damage, calculating possibilities. The windshield was too small, the rear window blocked by the trunk's intrusion into the cabin. That left the passenger side now facing skyward like an escape hatch to salvation. "Come on," he muttered, hauling himself up onto the car's exposed flank. The metal groaned under his weight, settling deeper into the soft earth with ominous finality. Every second counted now. The passenger door fought him like it was alive, like it understood what hung in the balance. Ethan's calloused hands found purchase on the twisted metal, his back muscles screaming as he wrenched it open with a sound like breaking bones. The woman stirred at the noise, her eyelids fluttering with the first signs of consciousness. "It's okay," he said, dropping into the inverted cabin. His knees hit broken glass and twisted plastic, but he barely noticed. "I'm going to get you out of here." Her eyes opened then, deep brown, unfocused, beautiful even through the haze of trauma. For a moment, they stared at each other across the wreckage of her world. Two strangers connected by the terrible intimacy of shared disaster. My purse," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the car's mechanical death rattles. "Forget the purse." Ethan was already working at her seatbelt, his fingers dancing across the buckle with practiced efficiency. "We need to move. Now." The belt released with a metallic click, and she fell forward into his arms with surprising grace. She was lighter than he'd expected, all elegant bones and expensive fabric, but solid enough to remind him she was real alive, depending on him for her next breath. "Can you move your legs?" he asked, already knowing they had no choice either way. She nodded weakly, and together they began the careful climb toward the passenger door. Every movement sent new protests through the wounded vehicle, new sounds that spoke of structural collapse and imminent catastrophe. Ethan boosted her up first, his hands steady on her waist, as she struggled through the opening, then hauled himself after her with the desperate strength of a man who'd already lost too much to fate. They tumbled onto the grass 20 feet from the wreckage, just as the fuel tank caught with a whump that sucked the air from their lungs. The explosion lifted them both off the ground, a wall of heat and light that turned the dawn into artificial noon. Ethan threw his body over the woman's, shielding her from flying debris as the Bentley became a funeral pyre for her former life. When the worst of it passed, when the roar faded to a hungry crackle, Ethan rolled away and found himself staring into those brown eyes again. They were clearer now, focused with the sharp intensity of someone who'd just glimpsed their own mortality and found it wanting. "Thank you," she breathed, and there was something in her voice, not just gratitude but wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe someone had risked everything for her without knowing her name, her worth, her place in the world's grand hierarchy. "Dad!" Jacob's voice cut through the moment, like cold water reminding Ethan of responsibilities that mattered more than mysterious women with sad eyes. His son was running toward them, his face pale with terror and relief. "Dad, are you okay? Is she okay?" Ethan sat up, checking himself for injuries he'd been too focused to notice. A few cuts, some singed hair, nothing that wouldn't heal. The woman beside him was moving more freely now, sitting up to watch the remains of her car paint the morning sky in shades of orange and black. "We're fine, buddy," Ethan said, opening his arms as Jacob crashed into him with the desperate embrace of a child who'd thought he might lose his only parent. "Everything's fine now." But as he held his son and watched the woman stare at her destroyed vehicle, Ethan knew nothing would ever be quite the same. There was something about her, something that made the air feel charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. When she looked at him, it was as if she was memorizing his face, filing away every detail for reasons he couldn't fathom. "I should call for help," she said, patting at her dress, with hands that shook only slightly. "My phone was in the car, but—" "Already done." Ethan pulled out his battered cell phone, showing her the emergency services contact screen. "Ambulance should be here in 15 minutes. Fire department too, though there's not much left to save." She nodded, then stood with the careful grace of someone testing their body's limits. The cream dress was torn and stained, her expensive shoes scuffed beyond repair, but she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of breeding education, a life lived far from the small-town struggles that defined Ethan's world. "What's your name?" Jacob asked, with the direct curiosity of childhood, looking up at her with wide eyes that held no judgment, only interest. The woman hesitated for just a moment, as if the question was more complicated than it should be. "Isabella," she said finally. "Isabella Marlowe." The name meant nothing to Ethan, but there was something in the way she said it, a weight that suggested it should. He filed the thought away, with all the other mysteries this morning had brought focusing instead on the practical concerns of aftermath and responsibility. "Ethan Cole," he replied, offering his hand with the kind of firm grip that spoke of honest work and reliable character. "This is my son Jacob." Her fingers were soft against his palm, unmarked by the kind of labor that had shaped his own hands into tools of creation and repair. But her grip was strong, steady, the handshake of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in rooms where serious things happened. Mr. Cole. She held his gaze with an intensity that made something flutter in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since Sarah died. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same thing. No. The certainty in her voice was absolute. They wouldn't have. The sound of approaching sirens began to whisper through the morning air, growing stronger with each passing second. Soon, this would become official reports to file statements to give the bureaucratic machinery of emergency response grinding into motion. But for now, in these last moments of quiet intimacy, Ethan found himself studying Isabella Marlowe's face, wondering what kind of story had put her on this empty highway at dawn, alone in a car worth more than most people made in a year. Are you from around here? He asked, though her clothes and bearing already suggested the answer. She shook her head, dark hair catching the early sunlight, in ways that made her seem almost ethereal. Just passing through. Business. The word carried undertones of complexity of a world where business happened in boardrooms and country clubs rather than small-town garages and family diners. The sirens were closer now, their wail cutting through the peaceful morning, like a promise of complication. Jacob pressed closer to his father's side, instinctively seeking comfort from the approaching chaos of adult responsibilities. Will we see you again? The boy asked, with the hopeful innocence of someone too young to understand how rarely life provided second chances with mysterious strangers. Isabella's smile was gentle but distant, the expression of someone already calculating departures, returns to a reality that had no room for small-town mechanics and their sons. I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. But even as she said it, Ethan could see the walls rebuilding behind her eyes, the careful distance that people of her obvious means maintained between themselves and the world of ordinary struggles. She was already leaving them even as she stood there in her ruined dress beside the smoking wreckage of her former transportation. The first ambulance crested the hill with a flash of red and white, followed closely by a fire truck, whose presence was more ceremonial than practical. The real emergency had passed, leaving only the cleanup and paperwork that always followed life's more dramatic moments. I should go, Isabella said, and there was something almost apologetic in her voice, as if she wished circumstances could be different, but knew they couldn't be. Of course. Ethan stood as well, Jacob's hand finding his with the unconscious need for anchor that had developed since his mother's death. Take care of yourself, Ms. Marlowe. She started to walk toward the approaching emergency vehicles, then turned back with an expression that seemed to hold entire conversations they'd never have. Mr. Cole, Ethan. Her voice carried a note of urgency, as if there were things she needed to say but couldn't find words for. What you did today, I'll never forget it. And then she was walking away, her torn dress billowing in the morning breeze, leaving Ethan and Jacob standing beside the settling ruins of what had been, until 20 minutes ago, an ordinary Tuesday morning. The EMTs would check them both for injuries, find nothing serious, and send them on their way with instructions to watch for signs of delayed shock. The fire department would foam down the smoldering Bentley, turning it from spectacular destruction into mundane cleanup. The state police would take statements, file reports, and close the case as a single vehicle accident, with no contributing factors beyond driver error and unfortunate timing. But as Ethan watched Isabella Marlowe disappear into the organized chaos of emergency response, he knew this morning had changed something fundamental in his small, carefully ordered world. She'd looked at him like he was someone worth remembering, someone whose actions mattered in ways that extended beyond the simple mechanics of rescue and survival. Dad, Jacob said quietly, tugging at his father's sleeve. You dropped something. Ethan looked down to see his son holding a wooden pencil worn smooth by years of use, the eraser end chewed to nothing by nervous habits and concentrated thought. It was his lucky pencil, the one he'd carried in his shirt pocket since trade school, the one he used for the important sketches, the crucial measurements that couldn't afford to be wrong. "Must have fallen out when I climbed up on the car," he said, taking it back and sliding it into its familiar place over his heart. But as they walked back toward their pickup truck, Ethan found himself wondering if Isabella Marlowe had noticed the pencil, if she'd seen it fall and understood its significance. People like her, people with money and education and complicated business dealings, probably didn't put much stock in worn wooden pencils and the men who carried them. Which was fine. Better even. Ethan had learned through marriage and loss, and the daily struggle of raising Jacob alone, that some distances were meant to be maintained. Some worlds were meant to remain separate. Isabella Marlowe belonged to a realm of possibility and privilege that had no room for small-town mechanics, no matter how willing they might be to risk everything for a stranger's life. The thought should have been comforting, a return to the familiar boundaries that had kept his life stable and manageable since Sarah's death. Instead, as he started the pickup and began the drive home, Ethan found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the emergency vehicles shrink into distant specks of light, carrying Isabella Marlowe back to whatever complicated existence had brought her to Route 12 at dawn on a Tuesday morning. "That was scary," Jacob said, his voice small in the truck's cab. "Yeah, buddy, it was. But you saved her. We all did what we had to do." Jacob was quiet for a moment, processing the morning's events with the careful thoroughness that made him seem older than his years. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Ethan considered the question, thinking about Isabella's composure, her obvious intelligence, the way she'd carried herself even in the aftermath of trauma. People like her, people with resources and connections, usually found ways to land on their feet. "I think she'll be fine," he said finally. "People like Ms. Marlowe, they're tougher than they look." What he didn't say, what he couldn't quite articulate even to himself, was the growing certainty that Isabella Marlowe's toughness came from necessity rather than nature. That beneath the elegant surface lay someone who understood loss, understood what it meant to have everything important slip away without warning. The thought stayed with him as they drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the diner where he ate breakfast every Sunday, past the elementary school, where Jacob spent his days learning about a world that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing year. This was their life, predictable, manageable, built around the simple rhythm of work and family and the small joys that made everything else worthwhile. But as they pulled into their driveway, as Jacob ran ahead to tell their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, about their morning adventure, Ethan found his hand drifting to the pencil in his shirt pocket, wondering if somewhere in the growing distance Isabella Marlowe was thinking about worn wood and calloused fingers and the kind of man who'd risk everything for a stranger's life without expecting anything in return. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had made everything seem dreamlike and strange, returning the world to its normal colors and familiar shadows. In a few hours, Ethan would be back at the garage, hands deep in engine trouble and transmission problems. Jacob would be in school learning multiplication and state capitals, and the extraordinary would fade back into memory where it belonged. But something had shifted, some careful balance had been disturbed by brown eyes and grateful smiles, and the weight of a stranger's life in his arms. As Ethan walked toward his front door, he carried with him the peculiar certainty that this morning's rescue had been just the beginning of something larger, something that would require all the strength and wisdom he'd built up through years of loss and recovery, and the daily choice to keep building a life worth living. The wooden pencil rested against his heart, a talisman of ordinary magic, in a world that had suddenly remembered how to surprise him. 2 years had passed since that morning on Route 12, and Ethan had almost convinced himself that Isabella Marlowe had been nothing more than a fever dream born of smoke and adrenaline. Almost. The wooden pencil still rested in his shirt pocket, worn smooth by nervous fingers during late-night sketches, when sleep refused to come, and sometimes in the quiet moments between customers at the garage, he'd catch himself wondering what had become of the woman with the grateful eyes and the ruined cream dress. Jacob had grown taller in those 2 years, his voice deeper, his questions more complex, but he still asked about her sometimes. "Do you think the lady from the car ever thinks about us, Dad?" He'd wondered just last week while they worked together in the garage, his small hands surprisingly steady as he helped sort bolts and washers into their proper containers. "I don't know, buddy." Ethan had replied the same answer he'd given a dozen times before. "Probably not. She's got her own life to worry about." But the truth was more complicated than that simple dismissal. Ethan did think about her more than was reasonable for a man who'd shared perhaps 10 minutes of conversation with a stranger. There had been something in Isabella's eyes that last morning, something that suggested their brief encounter had mattered to her in ways that went beyond simple gratitude. The intensity with which she'd memorized his face, the careful way she'd said his name, these details had lodged themselves in his memory like splinters, small irritations that refused to heal. Life in Cedar Falls had continued its predictable rhythm around these occasional moments of wondering. The garage stayed busy with the endless parade of mechanical failures that kept small-town America moving. Jacob excelled in school, his natural intelligence sharpened by the kind of focused attention that came from having a father who understood the value of education, even if he'd never had much formal schooling himself. Their little house on Maple Street remained a sanctuary of careful order, each room maintained with the meticulous care of a man who'd learned that stability was earned through daily attention to detail. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, had become something like family in the way that happened in small towns, where proximity and mutual assistance gradually evolved into genuine affection. She watched Jacob after school, when Ethan's work ran late, fed them both when the bachelor cooking got too repetitive, and offered the kind of gentle wisdom that came from 7 decades of watching life unfold in all its messy complexity. "You need to get out more," she'd tell Ethan during their weekly Sunday dinners, her pale blue eyes twinkling with the mischief of someone who'd decided that advanced age granted her license to meddle in other people's romantic lives. "Jacob needs to see his father happy, not just content." "I am happy," Ethan would protest, and it wasn't entirely a lie. His life had a comfortable rhythm, a sense of purpose built around meaningful work, and the daily joy of watching his son discover the world. If it wasn't the kind of happiness that poets wrote about, if it lacked the breathless intensity of his marriage to Sarah, it was still genuine, a quiet satisfaction that had taken him 3 years to build from the ashes of grief. But on this particular Thursday morning, in early October, as golden leaves drifted past the garage windows and the first hint of winter sharpened the air, Ethan's carefully constructed contentment was about to face its greatest test. The silver Honda Civic coughed into his parking lot like a sick animal, steam rising from beneath its hood in discouraged wisps that spoke of cooling system failure, and probably worse. Ethan looked up from the transmission he'd been rebuilding, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, and watched the car settle into silence with the finality of mechanical death. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, with the kind of fluid grace that made Ethan think for just a moment of someone else entirely. She was tall, slender, dressed in jeans and a simple blue sweater that suggested comfort rather than fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and when she turned toward the garage, her face held the expression of someone genuinely distressed by automotive betrayal. "Excuse me," She called out, her voice carrying a faint accent that wasn't quite local, but wasn't foreign either. I think my car just gave up on life. Any chance you could take a look? Ethan set down his tools and walked toward her, his experienced eye already cataloging the Honda's symptoms. The steam, the way it had shuddered before dying, the faint smell of coolant in the air, all signs of a cooling system that had finally surrendered to time and neglect. I can take a look, he said, extending a hand that was clean despite his work. Ethan Cole, you're not from around here. Her grip was firm, confident, but there was something in the way her fingers lingered against his palm that sent an unexpected jolt of recognition through his nervous system. Allie Mitchell. And you're right, I'm not local. Just moved here from Chicago for work. She smiled then, and something about the curve of her lips made Ethan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. I was hoping small-town mechanics might be more honest than city ones. Depends on the mechanic, Ethan replied, already moving toward the Honda's raised hood. But I can promise you straight talk. What's she been doing before she quit on you? Running hot for about a week now. I kept meaning to bring her in, but you know how it is, always tomorrow, always next week. Allie moved to stand beside him as he peered into the engine compartment, her presence somehow both comfortable and electric. Then this morning she just said, enough, and surrendered. The problem was immediately obvious to Ethan's trained eye. The radiator was cracked along its top seam, coolant had leaked steadily until the engine began overheating, and the thermostat housing showed signs of warping that suggested the damage might extend deeper into the motor itself. Well, he said, straightening up. The good news is she didn't throw a rod or blow a head gasket. The bad news is your radiator's done and we need to check whether the overheating damaged anything else. Allie nodded with the resignation of someone who'd expected bad news. How long? Day or two, depending on what I find. I'll need to order parts from the city, and that means overnight shipping if you need this done fast. I need it done right more than I need it done fast. She looked around the garage with the curious interest of someone genuinely fascinated by how things worked. This is a nice setup you have here. How long have you been in business? About 6 years on my own. Worked for other people before that. Ethan found himself studying her face as they talked, struck by something familiar in her features that he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just that small-town phenomenon, where everyone eventually reminded you of someone else, where the limited population created endless loops of recognition and misidentification. Dad! Jacob's voice echoed across the garage as he burst through the side door, his backpack sliding off one shoulder as he ran toward them with the boundless energy of 10-year-old enthusiasm. Mrs. Patterson said to tell you she's making pot roast tonight, and you better not be late again because she's tired of keeping food warm for people who don't appreciate good cooking when they... He stopped short when he noticed Allie, his natural courtesy kicking in despite his excitement. Oh, sorry. I didn't know you had a customer. Jacob, this is Ms. Mitchell. Her car broke down. Ethan felt the familiar pride that came with introducing his son, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Jacob invariably impressed adults with his combination of intelligence and genuine politeness. Ms. Mitchell, this is my son Jacob. Please call me Allie. She crouched down to Jacob's eye level with the kind of natural ease that suggested genuine comfort around children. And you're absolutely right about pot roast. It's a crime to keep good food waiting. What grade are you in, Jacob? 5th. I'm 10. Jacob's initial shyness was already melting under Ali's warm attention. Are you new in town? I know pretty much everyone and I've never seen you before. Brand new. Just moved here for work. Ali's smile was gentle, encouraging. I'm still figuring out where everything is. Maybe you could give me some recommendations for the important places, best pizza, good bookstore, that sort of thing." Jacob's eyes lit up with the joy of being treated as an expert. "Well, Mario's has the best pizza, but you have to ask for extra sauce or it's too dry. The bookstore is kind of small, but Mrs. Chen orders anything you want if you ask nice. And if you like art stuff, there's this cool gallery downtown that has different shows every month." "You like art?" Allie's interest seemed genuinely piqued, and Ethan found himself watching the interaction with growing fascination. There was something almost practiced about the way she drew Jacob out, as if she'd had extensive experience connecting with children. "I love drawing. Dad got me this set of pencils last Christmas that are amazing. You can blend the colors together and make it look like real painting, almost." Jacob was fully animated now, his hands moving as he described techniques and projects with the passionate intensity that had always marked his approach to the things that captured his imagination. "That sounds wonderful. I'd love to see some of your work sometime, if you wouldn't mind showing me." "Really, most adults just pretend to care about kid art." Allie laughed, a sound that was somehow both spontaneous and musical. "I never pretend about art. It's too important for that." Ethan felt something shift in his chest as he watched his son bloom under this stranger's attention. Jacob had always been somewhat reserved around new people, inheriting his father's tendency toward careful observation before trust, but with Allie, he seemed immediately comfortable, immediately himself. "Tell you what," Ethan said, checking his watch and calculating the day's remaining work. "Why don't we get your car situation sorted out first? Then maybe you'd like to join us for Mrs. Patterson's pot roast. She always makes enough for an army, and she'd be thrilled to have someone new to interrogate about their life story." Allie hesitated for just a moment, and Ethan caught something that might have been calculation behind her eyes before the warmth returned. "That's incredibly kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing," Jacob interrupted with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Mrs. Patterson loves company, and she's always telling Dad he needs to meet more people. Plus, she makes the best mashed potatoes in the entire world, and that's not just my opinion, that's scientific fact." "Well, if it's scientifically proven," Allie grinned at Jacob, then looked at Ethan with an expression that seemed to carry entire conversations they weren't quite ready to have. "I'd love to join you if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." Ethan found himself returning her smile with an ease that surprised him. "Mrs. Patterson will be delighted to have a new audience for her stories about what Cedar Falls was like when dinosaurs roamed the earth." As they worked out the details for the car repair and dinner arrangements, Ethan became increasingly aware of small things about Allie Mitchell that didn't quite add up to the picture she was painting of herself. Her clothes were simple but obviously expensive, cut with the kind of precision that spoke of designers rather than department stores. Her hands, while she claimed to work in an office, showed no signs of the keyboard calluses and paper cuts that usually marked desk jobs. Most tellingly, when she opened her purse to pay for the diagnostic work, he caught a glimpse of credit cards that bore names other than Allie Mitchell. But these observations felt churlish in the face of her obvious kindness toward Jacob, her genuine interest in their small-town life, and the way her presence seemed to bring color back into spaces that had felt gray for too long. Whatever Allie Mitchell's story might be, whatever small mysteries might surround her arrival in Cedar Falls, she was here now, and she was making his son smile in ways that reminded Ethan of all the reasons life was worth the daily effort of living it. Mrs. Patterson's dining room had been transformed for the occasion, her best china brought out from behind glass doors, candles lit despite the early hour, and flowers from her garden arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for holidays and special anniversaries. When Ethan knocked on her door at 6:30, Jacob bouncing with excitement beside him, she answered wearing her favorite dress and the pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. So, this is the mysterious Allie Mitchell, she said, taking their guest's hands in both of hers, with the warm possessiveness of someone who considered hospitality a sacred duty. Ethan told me you were lovely, but he didn't mention you were absolutely gorgeous. Come in, everything's ready. Allie's laugh was genuine, as she allowed herself to be swept into Mrs. Patterson's embrace of welcome. Thank you so much for including me. I have to admit, after 2 weeks of takeout and frozen dinners, the smell of real cooking is almost overwhelming. 2 weeks. Child, you've been starving yourself. Well, we'll fix that right now. I made enough food to feed half the county, because that's what you do when Ethan Cole is coming to dinner. That man can put away more pot roast than should be physically possible. The evening unfolded with the kind of easy warmth that made artificial family out of chosen connections, Mrs. Patterson regaled them with stories of Cedar Falls' more colorful residents. Jacob demonstrated his latest art projects, with Ali providing encouragement that seemed both knowledgeable and sincere, and Ethan found himself relaxing into conversation in ways that felt almost foreign after 2 years of carefully maintained emotional distance. So, what kind of work brought you to our little corner of paradise? Mrs. Patterson asked, as they settled into dessert and coffee, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp with the curiosity of someone who'd spent decades reading people for truth and evasion. Allie's pause was so brief, it might have been imaginary. Consulting work, business efficiency, organizational development, that sort of thing. I specialize in helping small companies streamline their operations. Fascinating, Mrs. Patterson said, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. And Chicago was getting too busy for you. Something like that. I needed a change of pace, somewhere I could focus on work without all the distractions of city life. Allie's smile never wavered, but Ethan caught something tighter around her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there moments before. Well, you certainly won't find many distractions here, Mrs. Patterson said cheerfully. Though we do have our moments of excitement. Why, just 2 years ago, Ethan here pulled a woman right out of a burning car, saved her life right there on Route 12. Made quite the impression on young Jacob. The coffee cup slipped in Allie's hands, not enough to spill, but enough to rattle against the saucer, with a sound like breaking glass. She recovered so quickly that anyone not watching carefully might have missed it entirely, but Ethan was watching, and he saw the momentary confusion, the flash of something that might have been recognition before she regained control. That must have been terrifying, she said, her voice carefully neutral, for everyone involved. It was pretty scary, Jacob said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone telling a favorite story. The car was upside down and on fire, and Dad just ran right down the hill without even thinking about it. He climbed up on top and pulled this lady out just before the whole thing exploded like a movie. Jacob has a tendency to dramatize, Ethan said mildly, though he was still studying Allie's face for clues to her odd reaction. It wasn't quite as heroic as he makes it sound. Don't listen to him, Mrs. Patterson interjected. I saw the whole thing from my kitchen window, and it was every bit as dramatic as Jacob says. The woman was very grateful, elegant thing, expensive car, obviously from money. She looked at Ethan like he was some kind of guardian angel. Allie's hands were steady now, but there was something different in her posture, a careful control that hadn't been there during the earlier parts of the evening. Did you ever hear what happened to her, the woman from the accident? Never saw her again, Mrs. Patterson said with obvious disappointment. Shame, really. She seemed like someone worth knowing, and Ethan could use more interesting people in his life. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Ethan found himself increasingly conscious of Allie's presence beside him, of the way she asked questions that seemed casual, but probed for specific information about his life, his work, his relationship with Jacob. There was nothing overtly suspicious about her curiosity. She was new in town after all, and it was natural for someone to want to understand their neighbors. But there was a quality of focused attention that reminded him uncomfortably of investigators or journalists, people who asked questions with agendas beyond simple social interest. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Jacob attached himself to Ali with the determined devotion of someone who'd found a new favorite person. "Will you come see my art studio tomorrow?" he asked, tugging at her sleeve with unconscious familiarity. "It's just the spare bedroom, but Dad set it up really nice with good light and everything, and I want to show you this painting I'm working on." "I'd love to see it," Ali said, and again her warmth seemed completely genuine. "But only if your father doesn't mind having another visitor." "Of course not," Ethan heard himself saying, though part of his mind was cataloging all the reasons this level of instant intimacy should concern him. "Come by the garage when you pick up your car. We're right next to the house, so Jacob can give you the grand tour." As they walked home through the crisp October night, Jacob chattering excitedly about Ali's promise to help him with some advanced shading techniques, Ethan found his thoughts circling back to her reaction during Mrs. Patterson's story about the accident. There had been something there, some flicker of recognition or understanding that went beyond normal sympathy for a dramatic tale. But trying to pin down exactly what he'd seen was like trying to catch smoke. The harder he concentrated, the more elusive it became. "I like her," Jacob announced as they reached their front porch. "She's different from other adults. She actually listens when you talk, you know, like she really cares about your answers." "She does seem very nice," Ethan agreed, fishing his keys from his pocket, while wondering why something that should feel like simple good fortune was instead triggering every instinct for caution he'd developed through years of protecting his small, careful world. "Do you think she'll stay in Cedar Falls?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying the particular quality of hope mixed with expectation that suggested this question mattered more to him than casual curiosity would warrant. "I don't know, buddy. People like Ms. Mitchell, they usually have options we don't. They can pick up and move whenever something better comes along." Jacob was quiet for a moment, processing this with the serious consideration he gave to all of life's potentially disappointing realities. But maybe she likes it here. Maybe she'll want to stay. As Ethan tucked his son into bed and settled into his own evening routine, he found himself hoping Jacob was right. There had been something about Ali Mitchell's presence that had changed the entire texture of the day, made ordinary conversations feel richer, and familiar spaces seem more alive. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd found himself imagining what it might be like to share daily life with someone again, to have adult conversation that went beyond customer service and parental responsibility. But as he lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling into night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Ali Mitchell was carrying secrets that went far deeper than simple career changes and geography. The woman who'd sat at Mrs. Patterson's dinner table, who'd encouraged Jacob's artistic ambitions with what seemed like genuine expertise, who'd laughed at stories and asked thoughtful questions about small-town life, that woman felt real, authentic, someone he could easily imagine caring about. The problem was the other woman, the one who'd appeared for brief moments throughout the evening. The woman who'd asked carefully targeted questions about his past, who'd reacted to the accident story with something more complex than normal sympathy, who carried herself with the unconscious confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, regardless of obstacles or complications. Ethan reached for the wooden pencil on his nightstand, rolling it between his fingers in the dark as he tried to untangle the threads of attraction and suspicion that Ali Mitchell's presence had woven through his carefully ordered world. Tomorrow she would come to see Jacob's art, and maybe in the clearer light of day, without Mrs. Patterson's romantic machinations, and Jacob's obvious infatuation influencing the atmosphere, he would be able to see her more clearly. But even as he made this rational plan for objective observation, Ethan knew he was already in deeper than safety would recommend. Allie Mitchell had walked into their lives like weather, unpredictable, powerful, impossible to ignore. Whatever her real story might be, whatever secrets she was carrying, she had already begun to change things in ways that couldn't be easily undone. The wooden pencil grew warm in his palm as sleep finally claimed him, and his last conscious thought was a question that would haunt his dreams. What did you do when the thing you most wanted might also be the thing that could destroy everything you'd worked so hard to build? The next morning brought the kind of crystalline October sunshine that made small towns feel like promises kept, and Ethan found himself whistling as he worked on Allie's Honda. The radiator replacement had gone smoothly, the thermostat housing showed no signs of warping after all, and barring any hidden surprises, she'd have her car back by noon. It was the kind of straightforward repair work that reminded him why he'd chosen this profession, problems with clear solutions tools that did what they were designed to do, and the satisfaction of returning broken things to working order. Jacob had been up since dawn reorganizing his art supplies and rearranging his makeshift studio with the nervous energy of someone preparing for an important presentation. He'd changed shirts twice, combed his hair 3 times, and asked Ethan no fewer than 6 questions about whether Allie would really think his paintings were any good. "She said she'd come, didn't she?" Ethan had replied, each time amused by his son's obvious anxiety. "And she seemed genuinely interested in your work, not just being polite." But what if she was just being nice because Mrs. Patterson was watching? Jacob had worried, holding up 2 different sketches as if the choice between them might determine his entire artistic future. What if she doesn't really care about art at all? "Then we'll find out," Ethan had said gently. "But I don't think you need to worry about that." Now, as he tightened the last clamp on the new radiator and wiped his hands clean, Ethan found himself sharing some of Jacob's anticipation. There had been something about Allie's interest in his son's artwork that had seemed professional, knowledgeable, in ways that went beyond polite adult encouragement. She'd asked specific questions about technique and materials, had nodded understanding, when Jacob mentioned color theory concepts that most adults would find baffling, and had made suggestions that showed real familiarity with artistic process. The bell above the garage door chimed at exactly 11:30, and Ethan looked up to see Allie walking toward him with a smile that made the morning seem brighter. She was dressed casually again, dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that somehow managed to look both expensive and effortless, and she carried a small paper bag that smelled tantalizingly of fresh pastries. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone genuinely happy to see him. "I brought coffee and Danish from that little bakery downtown. Figured it was the least I could do since you're probably finishing my car ahead of schedule." "Right on time, actually," Ethan replied, accepting the coffee with gratitude. "And you didn't need to bring anything, but I'm not going to turn down Maria's cinnamon Danish. How did you sleep? Mrs. Patterson's guest room comfortable enough?" Allie paused with her coffee halfway to her lips, and for just a moment Ethan caught something guarded in her expression. "Guest room. I just assumed when you said you were new in town, I figured you were staying with someone until you found a place." Ethan studied her face more carefully, noting the slight tension around her eyes. "Where are you staying?" "Oh, I found a little apartment right away. Nothing fancy, but it's furnished and convenient." The explanation came smoothly, but there was something rehearsed about it, as if she'd prepared this answer for exactly this question. Small towns are so much easier than cities for finding housing. Before Ethan could probe further, Jacob burst through the connecting door from the house, his face bright with excitement, and his arms full of art supplies and finished paintings. "Ali, you came. Wait until you see what I've been working on. I tried that blending technique you mentioned last night and it actually worked." He set his burden down carefully on a clean workbench and began sorting through canvases with the focused intensity of a curator preparing an exhibition. "I know you probably see a lot of professional art in Chicago, but I think some of these turned out pretty good." "Jacob," Ali said, and there was something almost breathless in her voice as she moved closer to examine his work. These are extraordinary." Ethan watched her face as she studied each painting, noting the way her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine amazement, to something that looked almost like recognition. Jacob had always been talented, but Ethan had assumed that was just parental bias combined with small-town standards. Seeing Ali's reaction, professional, knowledgeable Ali, who claimed to have connections to the art world, he began to understand that his son's abilities might be more significant than he'd realized. "This landscape," Ali said, lifting a canvas that showed the view from their back porch, rendered in soft pastels that captured not just the visual elements, but somehow the feeling of autumn afternoons. "The way you've handled the light, the atmospheric perspective, Jacob, this is museum-quality work." Jacob's face flushed with pride and disbelief. "Really? You're not just saying that—" "I never just say anything about art." Ali set the painting down with reverent care and turned to face both of them. "Jacob, you have a gift that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop. This isn't just talent, this is vision, technical skill, and emotional intelligence working together in ways that shouldn't be possible at your age." Ethan felt a surge of paternal pride mixed with something that might have been concern. Jacob was only 10 years old, still figuring out who he wanted to be when he grew up. And while artistic recognition was wonderful, there was something almost overwhelming about the intensity of Ali's praise. "What do you think he should do next?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the growing sense that this conversation was more important than it appeared. "To develop his skills, I mean." Ali was quiet for a long moment, studying not just the paintings, but Jacob himself as if she were calculating possibilities and potential outcomes. "He needs proper instruction," she said finally. "Not just local art classes, but real training with someone who understands exceptional talent when they see it." "Like who?" Jacob asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. "Well," Ali said slowly, "there are programs at some of the better art schools, summer intensives for gifted children, mentorship opportunities with established artists. It would mean travel significant expense, but for someone with Jacob's abilities." She trailed off, seeming to realize she was getting ahead of herself. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Programs at art schools, mentorship with established artists, significant expense, these were the kinds of opportunities that existed in a different world from Cedar Falls garage ownership and single-parent budgets. "That sounds amazing," Jacob said, his eyes bright with dreams that hadn't existed an hour ago. "Dad, could we do something like that?" Before Ethan could figure out how to navigate between his son's sudden aspirations and their financial reality, the bell above the garage door chimed again. A man in an expensive suit walked in his presence, immediately transforming the casual atmosphere into something formal and somehow threatening. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from courtrooms and boardrooms. "I'm looking for Isabella Marlowe. I have reason to believe she might be in this area." The coffee cup slipped from Ali's hands, hitting the concrete floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. The brown liquid spread across the floor like spilled secrets, and when Ethan looked at her face, he saw everything he'd been trying not to see, the truth he'd been avoiding since the moment she'd asked her first carefully targeted question about his past. "I'm sorry," The man continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension his words had created. I should introduce myself. I'm Richard Thornton, private investigator. I'm working for the Marlowe family to locate Isabella, who's been missing from Chicago for several weeks now. Isabella stood frozen in place, her face pale, but her chin raised with the kind of defiant dignity that spoke of someone who'd been caught, but refused to apologize for it. The carefully constructed persona of Ali Mitchell was crumbling away like a mask that had never quite fit properly, revealing underneath someone who belonged to the world of missing persons, investigations, and family concerns worth hiring private detectives to resolve. You're Isabella Marlowe, Ethan said quietly, and it wasn't a question. The pieces were falling into place now, the expensive clothes disguised as casual wear, the professional knowledge of art. The way she'd reacted to Mrs. Patterson's story about the accident, the credit cards in her purse that bore different names. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm Isabella Marlowe, the woman from the car accident. Jacob said, his young mind working through connections that were still warming in Ethan's consciousness. You're the lady Dad saved. Yes, Isabella repeated, and there were tears in her eyes now, threatening to spill over as she looked at Jacob with an expression of infinite regret. I'm the lady your father saved. The private investigator was taking notes, now his presence a reminder that this moment of revelation existed within larger contexts of family expectations and legal obligations that Ethan couldn't begin to understand. Ms. Marlowe, Thornton said, his tone professional but not unkind. Your family has been very worried. They've asked me to escort you back to Chicago so you can discuss whatever difficulties led to your disappearance. I didn't disappear, Isabella said, her voice gaining strength as she faced the investigator. I took a leave of absence from my responsibilities to handle some personal business. Personal business that involved assuming false identities and establishing residence under fraudulent pretenses. Ethan felt the ground shifting beneath him as the implications of the investigator's words sank in. False identities. Fraudulent pretenses. The woman he'd begun to care about, the woman his son had trusted with his artistic dreams, had built their entire relationship on lies so comprehensive he was only now beginning to grasp their scope. You lied, Jacob said, his voice small and hurt in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten with protective fury. You lied about everything. No, Isabella said quickly, turning toward them with desperate urgency. Not everything. Nothing about how I feel about you, nothing about your art, nothing about… You lied about your name. Ethan interrupted, his voice harder than he'd intended. You lied about where you're from, about why you're here, about who you are. What exactly wasn't a lie? My feelings, Isabella said, and there was naked honesty in her voice now, the first completely unguarded thing he'd heard from her since they'd met. Everything I felt, everything I said about Jacob's talent, everything about wanting to be here with you both, that was all real. But you're not Ali Mitchell, Jacob said, working through the betrayal with the painful logic of childhood. You're someone else completely, someone rich and important, who hired a detective to find you. I'm Isabella Marlowe, she said, crouching down to Jacob's eye level, despite the investigator's impatient presence. But I'm also someone who saw your father risk his life for a stranger and couldn't stop thinking about what kind of man does that without expecting anything in return. I'm someone who needed to understand what real kindness looked like, what real family felt like. So you came here under false pretenses to study us like specimens. Ethan's anger was building, now fueled by the growing realization of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. You wanted to understand real family, so you decided to infiltrate ours with lies and deception. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Isabella said, standing to face him, with tears streaming down her face. I was only going to stay long enough to thank you properly, to make sure you and Jacob were okay. But then I got to know. You really know you, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Ms. Marlowe, the investigator interjected, we really need to discuss your return to Chicago. Your family's concerns go beyond mere worry. There are business obligations, financial responsibilities that require your immediate attention. What kind of business obligations? Ethan asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Ms. Marlowe is the primary heir to the Marlowe Art Foundation, Thornton explained with professional efficiency. One of the largest private art collections in the Midwest, with galleries in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. Her absence has created significant complications for ongoing exhibitions, acquisitions, and donor relations. Art Foundation. Galleries in major cities. Now Isabella's professional knowledge of Jacob's work took on new and troubling dimensions. She hadn't just been encouraging a talented child, she'd been evaluating him with the expertise of someone who controlled millions of dollars in art-related resources. Is that why you were so interested in Jacob's paintings? Ethan asked, his voice cold with understanding. You were scouting talent for your foundation. No, Isabella said with fierce certainty. Jacob's talent is extraordinary, yes, but that's not why I... How can we believe anything you say? The words came out harsher than Ethan had intended, but the hurt in Jacob's eyes was making it impossible to think clearly about anything except protecting his son from further manipulation. You've lied about literally everything since the moment we met you. Your name, your background, your reasons for being here. How do we know your interest in Jacob isn't just another deception? Because you know me, Isabella said desperately. You know who I am when I'm with you. You know how I look at Jacob, how I listen when he talks about his art, how I thought I knew Allie Mitchell, Ethan interrupted. I don't know Isabella Marlowe at all. The silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with the weight of broken trust and the growing awareness that whatever they'd been building together had been constructed on foundations that couldn't support the truth. Jacob stood beside his father, his young face struggling to process the complexities of adult deception and the destruction of possibilities he'd only just begun to imagine. Mr. Cole, Thornton said, finally, his tone suggesting he'd witnessed similar scenes many times before. I apologize for the disruption this has caused your family. Ms. Marlowe's behavior has been unusual, but I can assure you that her presence in your lives was never intended to cause harm. But it has caused harm, Ethan said, looking at his son's confused and hurt expression. Jacob trusted her, believed she cared about him, let himself imagine possibilities that don't exist for people like us. They could exist, Isabella said quietly. Nothing about Jacob's talent is diminished by who I am. If anything, knowing what I know about the art world, having the resources I have. Stop, Ethan said sharply. Just stop. You think you can fix this with money, with connections. You think you can lie your way into our lives and then buy your way out of the consequences. That's not what I'm trying to do. Then what are you trying to do? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used us to play out some kind of fantasy about normal life. And now that reality has caught up with you, you want to make everything okay, with promises about Jacob's artistic career. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to realize that anything she said would only make the situation worse. The investigator checked his watch, with the impatience of someone accustomed to cleaner resolutions and simpler explanations. Ms. Marlowe, Thornton said, your family is expecting you back in Chicago by this evening. There are documents that require your signature decisions that can't be delayed any longer. I understand, Isabella said, her voice hollow with defeat. She looked at Jacob one more time, memorizing his face with the desperate intensity of someone who knew she was about to lose something irreplaceable. Jacob, I want you to know that everything I said about your talent was true. You have a gift that could take you anywhere you want to go in life. But you won't be there to help him get there, Ethan said, and there was finality in his tone that made it clear the conversation was over. No, Isabella whispered. I won't be there. She turned to leave, then stopped and pulled something from her purse, a small, worn piece of wood that Ethan recognized with a shock of painful memory. You dropped this, she said, holding out the wooden pencil he'd lost during the rescue 2 years ago. At the accident. I kept it thinking someday I might find a way to return it to you. Ethan stared at the pencil, his lucky pencil, the one he'd carried through trade school and early marriage, and all the small victories and defeats that had shaped his professional life. She'd kept it for 2 years, this woman who claimed not to have known his name, this stranger, who'd built an elaborate deception around returning a piece of worn wood to its owner. You planned all of this, he said, accepting the pencil with numb fingers. From the beginning. The broken car, the dinner invitation, everything. The broken car was real, Isabella said softly. That was just lucky coincidence, or maybe fate having a sense of humor. But yes, I came here looking for you. I've been thinking about you for 2 years, wondering what kind of man risks his life for a stranger and then disappears without expecting gratitude or reward. And now you know, Ethan said. I'm the kind of man who raises his son alone in a small town, fixes cars for a living, and doesn't appreciate being lied to by people who think ordinary life is some kind of anthropological experiment. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Isabella flinched, as if she'd been physically struck, and when she looked at him now, there was nothing left of the careful composure that had carried her through weeks of successful deception. You're right, she said. And I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than you'll ever know. She walked toward the door, the investigator following with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose job was nearly complete. At the threshold, she turned back one final time, her eyes meeting Ethan's across the space that now felt vast with broken trust and missed possibilities. For what it's worth, she said, these have been the best 3 weeks of my life. And then she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the small wooden pencil that had started everything. Ethan stood in his garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and machinery of his chosen trade, holding the token of a rescue that had somehow led to this moment of devastating clarity about the unbridgeable distances between different worlds. Jacob moved to stand beside him, his small hand slipping into Ethan's larger one, with the unconscious trust that had carried them through every difficulty since Sarah's death. Dad, he said quietly, are you okay? Ethan looked down at his son, 10 years old, extraordinarily talented, now carrying the weight of adult disappointment and the complex knowledge that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones most capable of betraying that trust. Yeah, buddy, he said, squeezing Jacob's hand with gentle pressure. I'm okay. We're okay. But as they stood together in the October sunshine streaming through the garage windows, Ethan knew that wasn't entirely true. Isabella Marlowe had entered their lives like a storm, bringing with her the promise of possibilities they'd never imagined, and leaving behind the wreckage of dreams that had no place in their carefully constructed reality. The wooden pencil felt warm in his palm, a reminder of the morning 2 years ago when he'd pulled a stranger from a burning car and set in motion a chain of events that had led inevitably to this moment of recognition and loss. He'd thought he was saving someone's life, but maybe what he'd really done was invite chaos into a world that had taken him 3 years to build from the ashes of grief. "Can we go inside?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion that came from processing too much adult complexity in too short a time. "Of course," Ethan said, leading his son toward the house while his mind struggled to process the complete reorganization of everything he'd thought he knew about Allie Mitchell, about trust, about the dangerous seduction of believing that people from different worlds could somehow bridge the gaps that separated their realities. As they walked through their front door, Ethan caught sight of Jacob's paintings still spread across the kitchen table where they'd been forgotten in the chaos of revelation. The landscapes and portraits that had seemed so promising an hour ago now felt like evidence of manipulation, tainted by the knowledge that their primary audience had been evaluating them with professional expertise rather than simple appreciation. But even as that bitter thought formed, Ethan had to admit that Isabella's reaction to Jacob's work had seemed completely genuine. Whatever else she might have lied about her amazement at his son's talent, had felt real, unguarded, the response of someone who truly understood the significance of what she was seeing. The problem was that it no longer mattered whether her artistic appreciation had been authentic. She'd poisoned everything else with deception, so complete that truth and lies had become impossible to separate, leaving behind only the certainty that Isabella Marlowe, billionaire heiress, art world insider woman, who hired private investigators and maintained false identities, had no more place in their lives than characters from television shows had in their living room. "Dad," Jacob said, settling onto the couch, with the careful movements of someone who'd aged several years in the course of a single morning. "Do you think what she said about my art was true? Or was that part of the lie, too?" It was exactly the question Ethan had been dreading, and exactly the question that mattered most. How do you help a 10-year-old navigate the complexities of partial truth embedded in comprehensive deception? How do you preserve his confidence in his abilities while protecting him from the manipulation of adults who wielded expertise like weapons? "I think," Ethan said, carefully, sitting beside his son and wrapping an arm around shoulders that seemed too thin to carry such complicated burdens, "that your talent is real regardless of what anyone else says about it. Whether Isabella was being honest about your abilities doesn't change what you can do with a paintbrush." "But she said I could go to art school, maybe work with real artists," Jacob said, his voice small with the particular disappointment that came from glimpsing possibilities that had been snatched away almost as soon as they appeared. "She said I had museum-quality work." "Maybe you do," Ethan said, "and maybe someday we'll find ways to develop your talent that don't involve people who lie about who they are. But right now what matters is that you keep painting, because you love it, not because someone else told you it might lead somewhere." Jacob nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who'd learned more about adult complexity than any 10-year-old should have to process, and they sat together in the quiet comfort of their small living room, while afternoon shadows lengthened across furniture that suddenly felt like sanctuary from a world that had proven itself more dangerous and deceptive than either of them had realized. The wooden pencil remained in Ethan's shirt pocket, pressing against his heart with each breath, a reminder that some rescues extracted prices that couldn't be calculated in advance, and some strangers carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment of first encounter. Outside their windows, Cedar Falls continued its predictable rhythm, but inside their small house, everything had changed in ways that would take months to fully understand, and longer still to heal. 3 weeks passed, like a slow hemorrhage each day, bleeding a little more color from their world, until even Jacob's paintings seemed muted, as if Isabella's departure had taken something essential from the light itself. Ethan threw himself into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts, staying at the garage until well past closing time, accepting every repair job that came his way, regardless of complexity or profit margin. But no amount of mechanical distraction could erase the memory of brown eyes filled with tears, or the way Isabella's voice had broken when she'd said goodbye. Jacob had retreated into a silence that was worse than any tantrum could have been. He still painted, but with mechanical precision rather than joy, producing technically perfect landscapes that felt hollow, emotionally vacant, as if he were copying someone else's vision rather than expressing his own. The spontaneous chatter about color theory and composition had disappeared, replaced by polite responses to direct questions and a careful distance from anything that might remind him of dreams that had turned out to be built on lies. Mrs. Patterson had tried to help bringing casseroles and gentle conversation, but even her considerable powers of comfort seemed insufficient against the particular kind of damage that comes from having trust betrayed by someone you'd allowed yourself to love. She'd taken to watching Ethan with the worried expression of someone who'd seen this pattern before, men who dealt with heartbreak by working themselves to exhaustion, children who learned too young that adults were capable of calculated deception. "You can't keep this up," she'd told him the previous evening, finding him still bent over an engine at 9 o'clock, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that made his shoulders ache. Jacob needs his father present, not just physically here, but actually engaged with living. "I'm engaged," Ethan had protested, but they both knew it wasn't true. He was going through the motions of daily life while some essential part of him remained frozen in that moment of revelation, in the garage, trapped in the endless loop of trying to separate truth from manipulation, in every memory of Isabella's presence in their levelle. The wooden pencil had become a kind of talisman, something he found himself touching throughout the day as if it might provide answers to questions he couldn't quite formulate. She'd kept it for 2 years, this stranger who'd claimed not to know his name. She'd built an elaborate deception around returning. It had risked exposure and consequences he couldn't imagine just to spend time in the ordinary world he'd built for himself and Jacob. The gesture felt simultaneously romantic and manipulative, genuine, and calculated, impossible to categorize in ways that would allow him to file it away and move on. But moving on was exactly what he needed to do for Jacob's sake, if not his own. The boy was watching him with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of abandonment or collapse, and Ethan knew that his own inability to process Isabella's deception was becoming another source of insecurity in Jacob's already complicated emotional landscape. So when the call came on a gray November morning, when Jacob's breath fogged the kitchen window as he stared at birds that no longer seemed to interest him, Ethan was actually grateful for the distraction of crisis, for something immediate and solvable that might jar them both out of the emotional stalemate that had defined their lives since Isabella's departure. The phone rang at 7:30 just as Jacob was mechanically eating cereal that had gone soggy while he pushed it around his bowl without enthusiasm. Ethan glanced at the caller ID, Cedar Falls Elementary, and felt the familiar spike of parental anxiety that came with unexpected calls from school. "Mr. Cole?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Henderson, Jacob's teacher, but there was something wrong with her tone, something that made Ethan's stomach clench with premonition. "I need you to come to the school immediately." Jacob collapsed during morning assembly. The words hit him like physical blows, driving the air from his lungs and making his hands shake as he reached for his keys. "Collapsed? What do you mean collapsed?" He was standing for the Pledge of Allegiance and he just fell down. "He's conscious now, but he's having trouble breathing and the paramedics are on their way. Mr. Cole, you need to get here right now." Ethan was already moving, grabbing his jacket and wallet, while his mind struggled to process information that didn't fit with anything he understood about his son's health. Jacob had always been small for his age, but healthy active, showing none of the warning signs that would suggest serious medical problems. But as he drove toward the school with his emergency flashers blinking, Ethan found himself remembering small things he'd dismissed, the way Jacob got winded more easily than other children, the occasional complaint about chest pain that they'd attributed to growing pains, the subtle pallor that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. The ambulance was already there when he arrived, its red and white presence in the school parking lot, like a beacon of every parent's worst nightmare. Ethan ran toward the building, with his heart hammering against his ribs, past concerned teachers and wide-eyed students, who stepped aside to let him through, following the sound of urgent voices toward the gymnasium, where his son lay on a stretcher, looking impossibly small and fragile. "Daddy," Jacob whispered when he saw him, the word carrying all the fear and confusion shown of a 10-year-old who discovered that his body could betray him without warning. "Something's wrong. I can't breathe right." "It's okay, buddy," Ethan said, taking Jacob's hand and trying to project calm he didn't feel. "These nice people are going to take care of you, figure out what's going on." The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, was already connecting monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed with the electronic rhythm of medical emergency. "Mr. Cole, I'm Sarah Martinez, and we're going to transport Jacob to Cedar Falls General right away. His heart rate is irregular, and his oxygen saturation is lower than we'd like to see." Heart rate. Oxygen saturation. The clinical language felt foreign and terrifying, reducing his vibrant, intelligent son to a collection of numbers and symptoms that might indicate catastrophe or might mean nothing at all. Ethan squeezed Jacob's fingers, trying to communicate strength and confidence through touch, while his own world tilted dangerously off its axis. "Can I ride with him?" he asked, though he was prepared to follow on foot if necessary. "Of course. We'll take good care of both of you." The ambulance ride passed in a blur of monitoring equipment and reassuring professional voices. Jacob, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Ethan held his hand and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Cedar Falls General Hospital appeared ahead of them like salvation, its emergency entrance bright with the harsh fluorescent promise of answers and solutions. And within minutes, Jacob was surrounded by doctors and nurses whose practiced urgency suggested they dealt with pediatric emergencies, often enough to know exactly what they were doing. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the attending physician, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of calm competence that made parents believe their children were in capable hands. She examined Jacob with thorough gentleness, asking questions about his medical history, while nurses drew blood and attached electrodes that would provide the diagnostic information they needed to understand what was happening. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, leading Ethan to a quiet corner of the emergency department where they could talk privately. "I need to ask you some questions about Jacob's health history. Has he ever complained of chest pain, shortness of breath, unusual fatigue?" "Sometimes." Ethan admitted feeling guilty for not taking those complaints more seriously. "But I thought it was just growing pains, maybe stress from school. He's been through a lot recently, we both have." "What kind of stress?" Ethan found himself explaining about Isabella, about the deception and departure that had left both of them struggling to process betrayal and loss. Hernandez listened without judgment, nodding understanding when he described Jacob's withdrawal, his loss of enthusiasm for the artistic work that had once brought him so much joy. "Emotional stress can certainly affect physical health," she said when he finished. "But based on what I'm seeing in Jacob's initial tests, I think we're dealing with something that was already present, something that stress may have exacerbated but didn't cause." "What do you mean?" Dr. Hernandez hesitated for a moment, and Ethan recognized the expression of someone who had to deliver news that would change everything while trying not to cause panic. Mr. Cole, I believe Jacob has a congenital heart defect that's been developing throughout his life. The echocardiogram shows structural abnormalities that would explain his symptoms, and the timing of this episode suggests the condition may be reaching a point where intervention is necessary. The words seem to echo in the sterile hospital air, each syllable carrying weight that Ethan's mind couldn't quite process. Congenital heart defect. Structural abnormalities. Intervention necessary. His 10-year-old son, who'd been painting landscapes just that morning, who'd been worried about breakfast cereal, and whether his art teacher would like his latest project, was lying in a hospital bed with something wrong with his heart. What kind of intervention? Ethan managed to ask, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. We'll need to do more comprehensive testing first, but preliminary indications suggest surgical repair may be required. It's a complex procedure, but one with excellent success rates when performed by experienced pediatric cardiac surgeons. Surgery. Ethan repeated the word, feeling like broken glass in his mouth. I know it sounds frightening, but I want you to understand that congenital heart defects like Jacob's are often completely correctable with proper treatment. Children go on to live completely normal, healthy lives after these procedures. How much? The question came out before Ethan could stop it, before he could pretend that practical concerns weren't immediately paramount in a crisis of this magnitude. How much does something like this cost? Dr. Hernandez's expression grew gentle with understanding. I know cost is a concern for every family, Mr. Cole. The social worker will work with you on insurance issues and payment options. What's most important right now is getting Jacob stabilized and determining exactly what type of repair he needs. But Ethan was already doing rough calculations in his head, estimating the kind of medical bills that pediatric cardiac surgery might generate. His insurance was basic, designed for routine health care, rather than major medical emergencies, and the deductibles alone would probably exceed his annual income. The savings account he'd been building for Jacob's college education might cover a fraction of what this would cost. And even if he mortgaged everything he owned, it might not be enough to pay for the kind of specialized care his son needed. Mr. Cole, Dr. Hernandez was watching him with the concerned expression of someone who'd seen this particular form of parental panic many times before. Jacob's condition is serious, but it's not immediately life-threatening. We have time to plan the best course of treatment time to work out the practical details. Right, Ethan said, trying to focus on what was most important. Can I see him? Of course. He's been asking for you. Jacob looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. His color was better now, his breathing more regular, but there was a fragility about him that made Ethan's chest tighten with protective fury at the unfairness of a world that would threaten his son's health when they'd already endured more loss than any family should have to bear. Hey, buddy, Ethan said, settling into the chair beside the bed and taking Jacob's hand with gentle pressure. How are you feeling? Scared. Jacob admitted, his young voice carrying the honesty that came with being too sick to maintain brave facades. The doctor said there's something wrong with my heart. There's something different about your heart, Ethan corrected, choosing his words carefully. But it's something they know how to fix. You're going to be okay, Jacob. I promise you're going to be okay. Are you sure? Jacob's eyes were wide with the particular fear that came from having your body betray you without warning, from discovering that the basic functions you'd always taken for granted might not be as reliable as you'd believed. I'm sure, Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being, regardless of what it might cost him, to make good on that promise. We'll figure out whatever we need to figure out, and we'll get through this together. That's what we do, right? We take care of each other. Jacob nodded some of the tension, leaving his small frame at his father's absolute certainty. They sat together in the steady rhythm of hospital time, where minutes stretched like hours, and every beep of monitoring equipment measured heartbeats that had suddenly become precious beyond calculation. The afternoon passed in a blur of tests and consultations. Specialists appearing with clipboards and gentle voices, nurses checking vital signs and adjusting medications that kept Jacob comfortable while they gathered the information needed to plan his treatment. Ethan stayed by his side through all of it, holding his hand during procedures, translating medical terminology into language a 10-year-old could understand, maintaining the calm confidence that was his most important job as Jacob's father. Dr. Martinez, the pediatric cardiologist who would oversee Jacob's care, confirmed Dr. Hernandez's initial diagnosis during an early evening consultation that felt like the most important conversation of Ethan's life. Jacob has what we call a ventricular septal defect with pulmonary valve stenosis, he explained, using a model of the human heart to show Ethan exactly what was happening inside his son's chest. Essentially, there's a hole between the heart's chambers and one of the valves isn't opening properly. It's been compensating for years, but the stress of growth and development has reached a point where surgical repair is necessary. When? Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Soon. Within the next 2 weeks, ideally. Jacob's condition is stable now, but delaying treatment increases the risk of complications that could affect his long-term prognosis. 2 weeks. Ethan's mind raced through the logistics of what would be required: specialized surgeons, hospital stays that might extend for days or weeks, recovery time that could keep Jacob out of school for months, medical bills that would probably cost more than his house was worth. "Dr. Martinez," he said finally, "I need to ask about cost. I have insurance, but I know it's not going to cover everything, and I need to understand what we're looking at financially." The cardiologist's expression grew sympathetic with the practiced compassion of someone who'd navigated these conversations many times before. "The total cost for surgery, hospital stay, and follow-up care will probably be in the range of $200,000 to $300,000. Insurance typically covers a significant portion, but patient responsibility can still be substantial." $300,000. The number hit Ethan like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his hands shake with the realization that his son's life might depend on resources he simply didn't possess. Even if insurance covered 80%, the remaining $60,000 exceeded everything he'd managed to save in 10 years of careful financial management. "I can see this is overwhelming," Dr. Martinez continued gently. "But I want you to know that we never refuse treatment based on financial concerns. The hospital has programs to help families manage costs, and there are charitable organizations that specifically assist with pediatric cardiac care." Charity. The word burned in Ethan's throat like acid, carrying all the implications of dependency and failure that went against everything he'd tried to build for himself and Jacob. He'd worked his entire adult life to be self-sufficient, to provide for his family through honest labor and careful planning, and now his son's survival might depend on the kindness of strangers and institutional benevolence. "Mr. Cole," Dr. Martinez was watching him with concern. "I know this is a lot to process, but what's most important is that Jacob gets the care he needs. Everything else can be worked out." "Right," Ethan said, trying to focus on priorities rather than pride. "What do we do next?" "Tonight, Jacob stays here for observation. Tomorrow, we'll schedule him for a cardiac catheterization to get more detailed images of his heart structure, and then we'll set up the surgery with Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the region." As evening settled over the hospital and Jacob drifted into medicated sleep, Ethan found himself alone with thoughts that circled endlessly around problems that seemed to have no solutions. $300,000 for surgery his son needed to survive. 2 weeks to arrange financing he didn't have for care that couldn't be delayed. A 10-year-old boy whose life had already been complicated by adult deceptions and disappointments, now facing medical crisis that would define his future in ways Ethan couldn't control or predict. He was still sitting beside Jacob's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, and trying to calculate impossible financial equations when he became aware of someone standing in the doorway. When he looked up expecting to see another nurse or doctor, his heart stopped completely. Isabella stood there in the hospital corridor, still and silent as a photograph. Her face pale with something that might have been fear or grief or simple shock at finding herself in this place at this moment. She was dressed simply expensively, her dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the elegant bones of her face, but there was nothing composed or controlled about her expression as she stared at Jacob's sleeping form, surrounded by medical equipment. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking his son. "I heard," she said, stepping into the room with movements that seemed uncertain, as if she weren't sure she had the right to be there. "Mrs. Patterson called me. She thought you might need help." "Mrs. Patterson called you?" Ethan felt a surge of anger at his neighbor's interference, at the presumption that he couldn't handle his family's crisis without assistance from the woman who'd already done enough damage to their lives. "She's worried about you, about Jacob." Isabella moved closer to the bed, her eyes taking in every detail of the monitors and machines that were keeping track of his son's vital functions. "She said he collapsed at school, that they think he needs surgery." "He does need surgery," Ethan confirmed, standing up so he could face her properly, so he could maintain some physical distance in a space that suddenly felt too small to contain both his anger at her presence and his desperate need for the kind of help she might be able to provide. "But that's not your concern anymore." "Of course it's my concern," Isabella said, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind of absolute certainty that spoke of resources and determination that most people couldn't comprehend. "Jacob is... You're both. This is my fault." "This isn't your fault. This is a congenital condition that's been developing his entire life. But the stress, the emotional trauma of what I put him through that could have triggered this episode made everything worse." Ethan wanted to argue with her, wanted to deny any connection between Jacob's medical crisis and Isabella's deception. But Dr. Hernandez had already suggested that emotional stress might have exacerbated an underlying condition, might have pushed Jacob's compromised heart past the point where it could compensate for structural defects. "Maybe," he admitted finally. "But that doesn't change anything. Jacob needs surgery, and I need to figure out how to pay for it without destroying our entire future." "How much?" Isabella asked, and there was something different in her tone now. Something that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of the world she came from, where problems could be solved with sufficient application of financial resources. "It doesn't matter how much. It matters to me." "How much, Ethan?" "200,000 to 300,000, depending on complications." The number felt even more impossible when he said it out loud, when he watched Isabella's face for signs of the shock that should accompany such astronomical figures. But Isabella didn't look shocked. If anything, she looked relieved, as if she'd been expecting something far worse than a number that represented more money than Ethan would earn in 5 years of honest work. "I can pay for it," she said simply. "No." "Ethan, no," he repeated with enough force to make Jacob stir in his sleep. When his son settled back into medicated rest, Ethan continued more quietly, but with no less conviction. "I won't take money from you. I won't let Jacob's health become another way for you to manipulate our assumptions. Is that what you think? This is manipulation? I think you're someone who's used to getting what you want by throwing money at problems. And I think you see Jacob's situation as an opportunity to buy your way back into our good graces. Isabella's face went white at the accusation, and when she spoke, her voice was shaking with something that sounded like barely controlled fury. You think I want to pay for your son's surgery, so you'll forgive me for lying about who I am. You think I'm calculating enough to use a child's medical crisis as leverage for personal reconciliation. I think you're calculating enough to build an entire false identity around returning a wooden pencil, Ethan shot back. I think you're calculating enough to infiltrate our lives for weeks while pretending to be someone you're not. So yes, I think you're capable of using Jacob's situation to serve your own emotional needs. The silence that followed was thick with accumulated hurt and mutual accusation. Both of them standing beside Jacob's hospital bed, while years of careful trust-building collapsed under the weight of circumstances and neither of them had chosen or could control. You're right, Isabella said, finally, her voice hollow, with something that might have been defeat or acceptance. I am calculating. I did lie to you about everything that mattered, and maybe my motives for wanting to help Jacob aren't entirely pure. She moved closer to the bed, looking down at Jacob's sleeping face with an expression of such profound tenderness that Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. But I love him, she whispered, and there was nothing calculated about the words. Nothing manipulative about the tears that started falling down her cheeks. I love you both, and I can't stand here watching him suffer when I have resources that could help him get better. Love, Ethan repeated, and the word tasted bitter in his mouth. You love us, but you built our entire relationship on lies. Yes, Isabella said simply. I did. And I'm sorrier about that than you'll ever understand. But Jacob is lying in a hospital bed because his heart is broken, literally broken, and I have the ability to fix that, even if I can't fix what I broke between us. By throwing money at it. By using the resources I have to help the people I care about most in the world. Isabella turned to face him fully, and there was nothing left of the careful composure she'd maintained during their previous confrontations. You can hate me for the rest of your life, Ethan. You can make sure I never see either of you again after this. But please don't let your pride cost Jacob his health when there's another option. The machines monitoring Jacob's vital signs beeped steadily in the silence that followed, measuring heartbeats that had become the most important sound in Ethan's universe. Outside the hospital window, Cedar Falls continued its evening routine, people going home to families whose biggest concerns were homework and dinner preparation, ordinary problems that seemed impossibly distant from the life and death calculations that had become Ethan's reality. If I let you pay for this, he said finally, it doesn't change anything between us. It doesn't mean I forgive you, doesn't mean you get to be part of our lives going forward. I know, Isabella said, and there was acceptance in her voice that spoke of someone who'd already calculated the cost of redemption and found it higher than she could afford. I'm not doing this to buy forgiveness. I'm doing it because Jacob deserves every chance at a healthy, happy life, and I can provide that chance. And what do you get out of it? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, looking at Jacob's sleeping form with the intensity of someone memorizing details that would have to last a lifetime. I get to know that the best part of my life, the only real part of my life, continues even after I'm no longer part of it, she said finally. I get to know that Jacob grows up healthy and strong and talented, that he becomes everything he's capable of becoming. And then you disappear again. And then I disappear again. She confirmed, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. If that's what you want. Ethan looked at his son at the monitors that tracked his vital signs, at the evidence of medical intervention that was keeping Jacob stable until surgery could repair the structural problems that threatened his future. $300,000. Money that could mean the difference between Jacob living a full, healthy life and spending his childhood managing a chronic condition that would limit everything he might hope to accomplish. Okay. He whispered the word, scraping his throat like broken glass. Okay. But I want everything in writing, everything legal and clear. This is a loan, not a gift. I'll pay you back, even if it takes the rest of my life. Isabella nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks with hands that shook slightly, with what might have been relief or grief or simple exhaustion. Whatever terms you want. Whatever makes this acceptable to you. And after Jacob recovers after the surgery and the follow-up care you leave, you go back to Chicago and your art foundation and your real life, and you stay out of ours. If that's what you want, Isabella repeated, though each word seemed to cost her something essential. That's what I want. Ethan lied because the truth was too complicated and dangerous to acknowledge even to himself. As they stood together in Jacob's hospital room, surrounded by the electronic evidence of medical crisis and the looming promise of surgical intervention, Ethan tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered about second chances and the possibility that love might be more important than pride, more valuable than the safety that came from keeping dangerous people at carefully maintained distances. But Jacob stirred in his sleep, and the monitors beeped their steady reassurance, and Ethan reminded himself that his son's health was the only thing that mattered, now the only consideration that could justify accepting help from the woman who'd already proven she was capable of breaking both their hearts with carefully calculated precision. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more consultations, more decisions about Jacob's care. But tonight, his son would sleep safely under medical supervision, and the impossible financial burden that had threatened to make treatment an unaffordable luxury was no longer an obstacle to getting him everything he needed to heal. The cost of that security would be measured in pride in principle, in the careful emotional distance Ethan had maintained since Isabella's deception was revealed. But as he watched his son sleep, as he counted heartbeats that had suddenly become precious beyond measure, he knew he would pay any price to ensure Jacob's future, even if it meant accepting help from the one person who'd already proven she could destroy everything he'd worked to build. The surgery lasted 8 hours, each minute stretching like an eternity, while Ethan paced the waiting room corridors, and Isabella sat motionless in a corner chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. They didn't speak to each other during those endless hours, the weight of their agreement hanging between them, like a debt that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully comprehend. But when Dr. Chen finally emerged from the operating suite, her surgical mask hanging loose around her neck, and her eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done, they moved toward her in unison, two people united by love for a child whose heart had just been mended by hands steadier than prayer. The surgery was completely successful, Dr. Chen announced, and Ethan felt his knees buckle with relief so profound it was almost painful. Jacob did beautifully throughout the procedure. We've repaired both the septal defect and the valve stenosis, and his heart function is already showing significant improvement. When can we see him? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from hours of fear and forced silence. He's in recovery now, still under anesthesia, but you should be able to visit within the hour. He'll be sedated for the rest of today, but by tomorrow morning, he should be awake enough for conversation. Isabella stood when Dr. Chen left to check on other patients, and for a moment they looked at each other across the waiting room, with the strange intimacy of people who'd shared a crisis that had stripped away everything except what mattered most. "Thank you," Ethan said simply, because despite everything that lay broken between them, gratitude was the only honest response to what she'd done. "Don't thank me yet," Isabella replied, her voice carrying an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "Wait until he's completely recovered, until he's back to being the extraordinary boy who paints landscapes that make grown adults weep with recognition." They were allowed into the cardiac intensive care unit, just as the sun was setting, beyond the hospital windows, painting the sterile corridors in shades of gold and amber that made everything feel more hopeful than it had any right to be. Jacob looked impossibly small in the narrow bed, surrounded by monitors and connected to tubes that carried life-sustaining medications into his bloodstream. But his color was better than Ethan had seen in months, his breathing deep and regular, despite the mechanical assistance. "The hardest part is over," the ICU nurse told them as they took positions on either side of Jacob's bed. "Children are incredibly resilient when it comes to cardiac surgery. He'll probably be awake and complaining about hospital food by tomorrow evening." Ethan reached for his son's hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines that snaked across his small forearm. Jacob's fingers were warm, his pulse steady beneath skin that no longer carried the subtle bluish tinge that had become so familiar. Ethan hadn't fully recognized it until it was gone. "He looks peaceful," Isabella said softly, and when Ethan glanced across the bed at her, he saw tears streaming down her face with the quiet intensity of someone who was trying not to make a sound. "He's going to be fine," Ethan said, as much to convince himself as to comfort her. "Yes," Isabella whispered. "He is." They stayed through the night, taking turns dozing in uncomfortable chairs, while nurses came and went with professional efficiency, checking vital signs and adjusting medications with the practiced competence that made recovery seem not just possible but inevitable. Jacob woke briefly around 3 in the morning, his eyes unfocused but seeking, and when he saw his father's face, he managed a smile that was worth more than any amount of money in the world. "Daddy," he whispered through the oxygen mask. "Did they fix it?" "They fixed it, buddy," Ethan confirmed, squeezing his hand with gentle pressure. "Your heart is perfect now." Jacob's gaze wandered across the room until it found Isabella, who was standing in the shadows by the window. Her presence both essential and somehow forbidden in the complex emotional landscape they were navigating. "Ali," he said, the name carrying recognition, despite his medication-induced confusion. Isabella stepped closer to the bed, her face luminous with something that might have been joy or heartbreak, or both. "I'm here, Jacob. I'm right here. Are you going to stay?" The question was slurred but unmistakable, carrying all the hope and vulnerability of a child who'd learned that adults could disappear without warning. Isabella looked across the bed at Ethan, her eyes asking permission for an answer she couldn't give without his consent. The agreement they'd made was clear: she would pay for Jacob's care and then disappear from their lives, allowing them to heal from her deception without the complication of her continued presence. But looking at his son's face, at the trust and love that survived even the revelation of her lies, Ethan found himself questioning whether the clean break they'd negotiated was really what any of them needed. "We'll talk about that when you're feeling better," Ethan said finally, the diplomatic response of someone buying time to figure out what the right answer might be. Jacob nodded and drifted back into sleep, but the question lingered in the air between them, demanding resolution that neither Ethan nor Isabella was ready to provide. The next few days passed in the suspended reality of hospital time, where ordinary concerns like work and school schedules became irrelevant in the face of medical routines that measured progress in increments of healing, too small for civilian observation. Jacob's recovery exceeded every expectation, He was sitting up by the second day, walking with assistance by the third, and demanding real food instead of clear liquids by the fourth. His color continued to improve. The subtle breathlessness that had limited his activities for months disappeared completely, and his energy levels returned with the explosive force of a dam breaking after years of careful containment. Isabella came to the hospital every day, arriving early in the morning, with coffee for Ethan and art supplies for Jacob, staying late into the evening to read stories or help with the occupational therapy exercises designed to rebuild his strength. She was careful to maintain appropriate distance, never presuming intimacy that hadn't been explicitly granted, but her presence became part of the rhythm of Jacob's recovery in ways that felt both natural and impossibly complicated. "She doesn't have to keep coming," Ethan told Mrs. Patterson during one of her visits, watching through the hospital room window as Isabella helped Jacob with a watercolor painting that was already showing signs of the technical brilliance that had impressed her months ago. "No," Mrs. Patterson agreed, settling into the visitor's chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd orchestrated events according to her own mysterious plan. "She doesn't have to, but she wants to, and Jacob lights up every time she walks through that door, and you look like a man who's fighting something he knows he's already lost." "I haven't lost anything," Ethan protested. "She lied to us about everything that mattered." "She lied about her name and her background," Mrs. Patterson corrected with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to willfully obtuse students. "But I've been watching her with that boy for the past week, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that everything she feels for him is completely genuine." "How can you be sure?" "Because you can't fake the way she looks at him when she thinks no one's paying attention. You can't manufacture the kind of pride she shows when he completes a difficult painting. And you certainly can't counterfeit the way she's been sitting in that chair every night, watching him sleep, like she's afraid he might disappear if she looks away for too long." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him from further disappointment, but Mrs. Patterson's observations matched his own reluctant conclusions. Whatever else Isabella might have deceived them about her love for Jacob appeared to be the one completely honest thing in their complicated relationship. "Even if that's true," he said, "it doesn't change the fact that she built everything on lies. How do I know she won't do it again? How do I know anything she says can be trusted?" Mrs. Patterson studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd spent 75 years watching people lie to themselves about what they really wanted. "You don't," she said finally. "That's what trust is, Ethan, choosing to believe someone despite the risk that they might hurt you again. And that woman in there has spent the last week proving that Jacob's welfare matters more to her than her own comfort, her own safety, her own pride. If that's not trustworthy behavior, I don't know what is." The conversation stayed with Ethan through the afternoon and into the evening, when Jacob was finally discharged with instructions for home care that included regular medication, restricted activity levels, and follow-up appointments that would monitor his progress over the coming months. The drive home felt momentous in ways that simple geography couldn't explain. They were returning to their house on Maple Street, as changed people carrying experiences that had fundamentally altered their understanding of what was possible and what mattered most. Isabella followed them in her rental car, having volunteered to help with the transition home, and as they pulled into their familiar driveway, Ethan realized he was about to face the moment he'd been avoiding since Jacob's collapse. Their crisis was over, his son was healed, and according to their agreement, it was time for Isabella to return to Chicago and leave them to rebuild their lives without the complication of her presence. But as Jacob settled into his own bed for the first time in a week, as he looked around his room at the paintings and art supplies that represented dreams Isabella had helped him envision, the simple solution they'd negotiated began to feel like amputation rather than healing. "Dad," Jacob said, as Ethan tucked him in with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to take bedtime routines for granted. "Is Ali really going to leave tomorrow?" "That's the plan," Ethan replied, though the words felt like lies even as he spoke them. "But why? I mean, I know she lied about her name and stuff, but she saved my life. She paid for my surgery when we couldn't afford it. Doesn't that count for something?" Ethan sat on the edge of Jacob's bed, looking into eyes that carried wisdom no 10-year-old should have to possess, and tried to find words for concepts that didn't have easy explanations. "It counts for everything, Jacob. But trust is complicated. When someone lies to you about important things, it makes it hard to believe them about other things, even when you want to. But she told the truth about my art being good, right? She told the truth about wanting to help me get better at painting. I think so, yes. And she told the truth about loving us, even if she couldn't tell the truth about her name." The question hit Ethan like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the distinction between deception about identity and dishonesty about emotion that he'd been deliberately avoiding. "I think she did tell the truth about that," he admitted. Jacob was quiet for a moment, processing this with the serious consideration he gave to all of life's more complicated problems. "Dad," he said finally, "I know she lied, and I know that hurt your feelings, but she also saved my life and she makes us both happy when she's here. Maybe sometimes the truth about how someone feels is more important than the truth about who they used to be." Ethan stared at his son, amazed by the emotional sophistication that seemed to have developed alongside his artistic talents, humbled by wisdom that made his own defensive reactions seem petty and small. "When did you get so smart about people?" he asked. "I don't know," Jacob said, with the honest uncertainty of childhood. "Maybe getting my heart fixed made me better at understanding how other people's hearts work too." After Jacob fell asleep, Ethan found Isabella sitting on their front porch, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than usual in the clear November air. She'd changed out of the hospital clothes she'd worn for a week, back into jeans and a simple sweater that made her look like the Ally Mitchell he'd first met rather than the Isabella Marlowe, who owned art galleries and hired private investigators. "Beautiful night," she said, without looking at him as he settled into the chair beside her. "Yeah, it is." Ethan studied her profile in the starlight, noting the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of weariness that came from carrying emotional weight that never got lighter. "Thank you for everything you did this week. I know I didn't say it enough during all the crisis, but Jacob owes his life to your generosity." "We both know it wasn't generosity," Isabella replied softly. "It was guilt and love and the desperate need to fix something I'd broken." "Maybe, but the motivation doesn't change the result. My son is healthy because of what you did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of Cedar Falls settling into evening distant televisions, dogs barking the occasional car, passing on streets that had become as familiar to Isabella during her weeks of deception as they'd been to Ethan his entire adult life. "I should go pack," Isabella said eventually. "My flight leaves at 10 tomorrow morning." "Jacob asked me why you were leaving." Isabella turned to look at him, then her face visible in the light from their living room window. "What did you tell him?" "That trust is complicated. That when someone lies about important things, it makes it hard to believe them about other things." "And what do you believe about me now?" Ethan considered the question, weighing everything he'd learned about Isabella Marlowe against everything he'd experienced with Ally Mitchell, trying to separate calculated deception from authentic emotion in the complex mixture of truth and lies that had defined their relationship. "I believe you love Jacob," he said finally. "I believe your reaction to his art was completely genuine. I believe you would do anything to protect him from harm, including disappearing from his life if you thought that was best for him. And what do you believe about how I feel about you?" The question hung in the night air like a challenge demanding honesty that might complicate everything they'd tried to resolve through careful distance and clear agreements. "I believe you fell in love with the idea of us," Ethan said carefully. "With the fantasy of simple life, uncomplicated relationships, the kind of family that exists in movies and television shows, but not in real life." "You're wrong," Isabella said, her voice carrying quiet certainty that made him look at her more closely. "I didn't fall in love with an idea. I fell in love with you. With the man who risks his life for strangers without expecting gratitude. With the father who works 18-hour days to provide for his son, but never misses a bedtime story. With someone who builds art studios in spare bedrooms and carries lucky pencils and believes that honest work is more valuable than inherited wealth." "Then why did you lie about who you were?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands as if they might contain answers to questions she'd been avoiding since the day she'd first introduced herself as Allie Mitchell. "Because Isabella Marlowe has never been loved for who she is," she said finally. "Isabella Marlowe gets loved for what she owns, what she can provide, what she represents in terms of social status and financial security. I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for something other than my bank account. And now you know." "Now I know," she confirmed. "And I know that I ruined it by being dishonest about everything that should have mattered." Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking up at stars that seemed to be listening to their conversation with the patient attention of celestial observers who'd witnessed similar scenes played out across countless front porches in countless small towns. "Jacob thinks the truth about how someone feels is more important than the truth about who they used to be," he said. Isabella smiled at that, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her since the night they'd had dinner at Mrs. Patterson's house. "Jacob is wise beyond his years." "He is. He's also right, I think." "About what?" Ethan turned to face her, studying the woman who'd entered their lives through deception, but had proven her love through sacrifice that went far deeper than simple financial assistance. "About you. About us. About the fact that some truths matter more than others." "Ethan," Isabella said, and there was something breathless in her voice, as if she was afraid to hope for possibilities that had seemed permanently closed. "I'm not saying I understand everything about your world or that I'm ready to trust you completely," he continued. "But I'm saying that maybe we don't have to figure everything out all at once. Maybe we could try being honest with each other going forward, see what that looks like." "What would that mean practically?" Ethan considered the question, thinking about the logistics of building a relationship between people whose lives existed in completely different universes of expectation and possibility. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that Jacob is happier when you're here. I know that you understand his art in ways that could help him develop his talents. And I know that I've been happier these past few weeks than I've been since Sarah died, even with all the complications and confusion." "I can't move to Cedar Falls permanently," Isabella said. "I have responsibilities in Chicago, business obligations that require my presence. But I could spend time here maybe a few days every month, maybe longer periods during school vacations. And when you're here, you'd be Isabella, not Ali. When I'm here, I'd be whoever you and Jacob need me to be. Isabella, who owns art galleries, Ali, who helps with painting techniques, or just the woman who loves you both more than she's ever loved anything in her life." The words settled between them like promises that would need to be tested through time and experience, through the daily choice to keep choosing each other, despite the complications that came with loving, across the boundaries that separated their different worlds. Mrs. Patterson is going to be insufferably smug about this, Ethan said, and Isabella laughed with the musical sound that had first caught his attention in the garage all those weeks ago. Mrs. Patterson orchestrated this entire reconciliation, Isabella replied. She called me the night Jacob collapsed, told me that pride was a luxury neither of us could afford when a child's life was at stake. She meddled. She intervened. There's a difference. And you think this can work? You think we can build something real despite everything that's been broken? Isabella reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become familiar during their hospital vigil, the simple human connection that had sustained them through crisis and might sustain them through whatever came next. I think love is more resilient than either of us realized, she said. I think Jacob's heart isn't the only thing that got repaired this week. And if it doesn't work, if the distance becomes too much, or if the complications of your real life make this impossible, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now, tonight, we're here together, and Jacob is healthy and sleeping in his own bed, and that feels like enough foundation to build on. Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling the truth of what she was saying, in the simple contact between their fingers, in the way her presence made their front porch feel more like home than it had in years. Okay, he said the word carrying all the weight of new beginnings and second chances. Let's try. They stayed on the porch until well past midnight, talking about practical arrangements and impossible dreams, about Jacob's artistic future, and the logistics of love that spanned the distance between small-town garages and big-city galleries. When they finally went inside, Isabella kissed him goodnight at the bottom of the stairs with the gentle reverence of someone who'd been given a second chance she'd never expected to receive. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. "For what?" "For being the kind of man worth lying about my entire life to get close to. For raising the kind of son who believes love is more important than pride. For saving my life twice, once from a burning car, and once from a life that was beautiful and successful and completely empty. Thank you for paying for Jacob's surgery, for staying with us through the crisis, for teaching me that some risks are worth taking even when you can't predict the outcome." Isabella smiled and started up the stairs toward the guest room that would become hers during the visits. They were planning the space that would allow her to be part of their family while maintaining the independence that made their relationship possible rather than suffocating. "Isabella," Ethan called when she reached the landing. "Yes. Tomorrow, when Jacob wakes up and asks if you're staying, what should I tell him?" "Tell him that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. Tell him that love doesn't always follow the rules people expect it to follow. Tell him that we're going to try something new. Something that doesn't have a name yet, but feels right. And if he asks what that makes us, what we call this arrangement." Isabella paused, considering the question with the careful attention she'd learned to give to matters that involved Jacob's emotional well-being. "Tell him we're family," she said finally. "Not the kind that shares DNA or legal documents, but the kind that chooses to keep showing up for each other day after day, regardless of distance or difficulty, or the fact that love doesn't always come in packages that society knows how to label." 3 months later, on a February morning, when snow covered Cedar Falls like a blessing, and Jacob's latest painting showed technique that would have impressed professional artists twice his age, Ethan found himself standing in his garage holding the wooden pencil that had started everything. Isabella was due to arrive that evening for a week-long visit, that had become as regular and anticipated as seasonal changes, and Jacob had been preparing for days, reorganizing his art studio and practicing new techniques he wanted to share with the woman who'd become his mentor, his supporter, and something like a second parent in ways that defied conventional definition. Their unconventional family structure was working better than anyone had dared hope. Isabella spent 2 weeks each month in Cedar Falls, time that had become precious to all of them for different reasons. Jacob thrived under her artistic guidance and the expanded worldview she brought to his small-town perspective. Ethan found himself looking forward to her visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with financial security, and everything to do with the way she made ordinary moments feel rich with possibility. And Isabella had discovered that dividing her time between Chicago responsibilities and Cedar Falls relationships created a balance she'd never known she needed, grounding her cosmopolitan life in the kind of authentic connection that money couldn't purchase. The Art Foundation continued to flourish under her leadership, but now it included scholarship programs for rural students like Jacob, initiatives that brought professional instruction to small communities that had never had access to such resources. Jacob's own work had begun attracting attention from educators and critics who recognized exceptional talent, regardless of its humble origins, and there were already discussions of summer programs and mentorship opportunities that would expand his artistic education without requiring him to abandon the stability of home. "Dad." Jacob's voice echoed across the garage as he burst through the connecting door, his face bright with excitement and his arms full of painting supplies. "Isabella's plane landed early. Mrs. Patterson just called from the airport. They're on their way here now." Ethan smiled at his son's enthusiasm, remembering the sullen, withdrawn boy who'd emerged from Isabella's first deception, and marveling at the resilience that had allowed Jacob to forgive, to trust again, to open his heart to possibilities that included loving someone whose presence in their lives would always require conscious choice rather than simple proximity. "Did you finish the painting you wanted to show her?" "Just this morning." "Wait until you see it." "Dad, I figured out how to make the snow look like it's actually falling instead of just sitting on the trees. Isabella taught me this technique for atmospheric perspective that makes everything look more realistic." As they prepared for Isabella's arrival, Ethan reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 2.5 years ago, he'd pulled a stranger from a burning car and thought he was simply doing what any decent person would do in similar circumstances. He'd had no way of knowing that rescue would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about trust, love, and the possibility that some lies were told in service of deeper truths. The sound of car doors slamming in their driveway sent Jacob racing toward the front door, and Ethan followed at a more measured pace, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned that second chances were sometimes more valuable than first impressions, that love was more complicated and more resilient than he'd ever imagined. Isabella appeared in their doorway with her arms full of art supplies and her face luminous with the particular joy that came from returning to places where she was welcomed not for what she owned, but for who she chose to be. Jacob launched himself into her embrace with the unself-conscious affection of someone who'd learned that love could survive deception, betrayal, and the difficult work of forgiveness. "I missed you," she said, holding him tight, while her eyes met Ethan's over his head, communicating in the silent language they'd developed through months of navigating the complexities of their chosen family structure. "We missed you too," Ethan replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As they settled into the comfortable rhythm of Isabella's presence in their home, as Jacob excitedly displayed his latest artistic achievements, and Isabella shared news from her Chicago life that increasingly felt like reports from a foreign country she visited for business rather than the place where her heart resided. Ethan understood that they'd managed to build something unprecedented, a family bound not by law or biology, but by the conscious daily choice to keep showing up for each other, regardless of distance, difficulty, or the skepticism of people who couldn't understand love that didn't fit conventional categories. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing Mrs. Patterson's latest culinary masterpiece and listening to Jacob describe his plans for a series of paintings that would document the changing seasons in Cedar Falls, Ethan caught Isabella's eye and saw reflected there the same quiet amazement he felt at what they'd managed to create together. Love it turned out was not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to build something beautiful with someone whose imperfections complemented your own. Trust was not about the absence of risk, but about the willingness to be vulnerable despite the possibility of disappointment. And family was not about sharing blood or legal documents, but about the commitment to keep choosing each other day after day through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made life worth living. Later that night, after Jacob had gone to bed, clutching the new set of professional brushes Isabella had brought him after they'd planned the week's activities and discussed Jacob's upcoming art show at the local gallery that had become eager to display his work, Ethan and Isabella found themselves back on the front porch where so many of their most important conversations had taken place. "Thank you." Ethan said the words, carrying the weight of gratitude that had accumulated over months of watching his son flourish under her guidance, of experiencing the particular contentment that came from love that had been tested and had proven stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. "For what this time?" Isabella asked, settling into her chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "For proving that some stories don't end the way they're supposed to. For showing Jacob that love is more important than perfection. For teaching me that second chances are sometimes more valuable than first impressions." "You saved my life first," Isabella reminded him. "I'm just returning the favor." "You saved more than my life," Ethan said. "You saved my capacity to believe that extraordinary things could happen to ordinary people, that love could cross any distance, survive any deception, bridge any gap between different worlds." Isabella reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of people who'd learned to communicate through touch as much as words. "We saved each other," she said simply. "And we're going to keep saving each other day after day for as long as we keep choosing to show up for this beautiful, impossible, completely unprecedented family we've built together." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human complications, but somehow blessing the love that had learned to flourish in the space between certainty and risk, between the life Ethan had built from the ashes of grief and the life Isabella had abandoned in search of something more authentic than inherited privilege. In his shirt pocket, the wooden pencil pressed against his heart, with each breath no longer a reminder of rescue and obligation, but a symbol of the kind of love that begins with one person willing to risk everything for a stranger, and ends with two people choosing each other across every obstacle that tries to keep them apart. Their story would continue written in the daily choice to bridge distance and difficulty measured in Jacob's artistic growth and the quiet contentment that comes from love that has been tested and found strong enough to bear the weight of imperfect people building perfect moments together. Some families were born, some were made, and some were chosen through the mysterious alchemy of need and generosity, crisis and healing, lies that served deeper truths and truth that proved more resilient than any deception. Under the vast Illinois sky, in a small town where extraordinary love had disguised itself as ordinary kindness, three people who'd found each other through accident and stayed together through choice continued the daily work of proving that some stories are too strong to be broken by the complications that try to end them before they've had a chance to reveal their true meaning. The pencil remained in Ethan's pocket, warm against his heart, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures of human decency create ripples that reshape entire lives, and sometimes the people you rescue end up rescuing you in return, and sometimes the families you build through choice prove stronger than any family you could have inherited through chance. In the end, love had proven more complicated, more resilient, and more transformative than any of them had dared hope, creating something unprecedented from the raw materials of crisis forgiveness and the extraordinary courage required to keep showing up for each other, despite every reason that should have made them walk away.